All right, so I just got home last night from an incredible trip to Squamish. It was an amazing time, but what's almost even better is I came home to a really cool surprise. So this is the brand new Ibis HD6. I had an old HD4 and I absolutely loved that bike. It was one of my favorite bikes I have ever owned, and now I get to ride its newer brother. So let's jump in and ride this thing. All right, let's talk about a couple of new things about the HD6. First of all, this is the very first Ibis that has ever been a mullet. The HD6 has 165 millimeters of rear wheel travel, and it has a 180 millimeter fork. So while this is still a DW Link bike, it has a little bit different look for Ibis. Man, my neck is killing me. I gotta stop doing this. Anyway, the coil shock destroying clevis that made shock options pretty limited on other Ibis bikes is now gone in favor of this little guy, the mount in front of the seat tube. So it's going to allow you to run coil shocks, which Ibis says this bike is progressive enough for both air and coil shocks. So getting into the geometry here, we have a 64-degree head tube angle and a 77-degree seat tube angle. The reach on this bike is a roomy 508 millimeters in size extra large. And the wheelbase is a 1288 millimeter wheelbase. And that is a little bit shorter than most other contemporary enduro bikes. And I think it comes down to this, the chainstay. We've got a 435 millimeter chainstay. So Ibis has generally been on the short side of things, and they have been a little slower to adopt the longer chainstay movement. There are a couple of things to note here. I did notice this bike has a little bit lower bottom bracket. I smacked pedals, and I don't smack pedals frequently, so I decided I wanted to measure. We've got a 275 millimeter bottom bracket height here. I just pulled my Yeti SB160, which is quite a bit longer, as you can tell. You know, we've maybe got 5 more millimeters up there. So it is a little bit lower, which I do think really helps it in the corners, but we'll get to that. One thing I do want to talk about on this bike is build quality. So this bike is relatively reasonably priced for a boutique bike. At $6,100, you get Fox factory suspension stock, and this is the GX bike that I'm riding. So really not a terrible price, although it does go up to $11,199 for the top shelf build. Speaking of build, there are two things I want to call attention to. One is I wish this bike had in-frame down tube storage, which these days seems to be more of a standard on new bikes rather than like a bonus feature. Ibis has helped out here though with mounts underneath the top tube, so you could put whatever bracket to hold all your tools and things. They also make a pork chop bag that kind of sits right in here, and that's where you could stuff all your things. So you're not gonna need a backpack, but in-frame storage would have been really nice. This is the one that bothers me. This is a size extra large frame, and we have a 170 millimeter dropper. Way too short. Look how much clearance we have here. We could definitely fit quite a bit longer dropper on there. I will say some of the other builds do come up with 185 millimeters, which is still too short. Call me a princess, but really anything less than 210 on a size extra large, too short. Now, let's talk about how this thing rides. The HD6 is very much an Ibis, especially on the climbs. It is very efficient and calm under pedaling forces. In fact, if it did not have to be built up to enduro standards, meaning kind of heavier, burlier components, it would be a very, very fast climber because it is super efficient. Definitely do feel those heavy, grippy tires and just the overall weight of the bike, but you take all that away and it would be very fast. And it's not a bad thing that it's heavy either. It's an enduro bike. It's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be burly. It's supposed to have tires that aren't going to flat easily. It's supposed to be able to race downhill very quickly. So I picked this bike up the day after spending a week at sea level. So I had sea level lungs, not Utah lungs. And I immediately went for a big ride at 8,000 feet. And the fact that I did not have to call my wife to pick me up from the middle of the woods speaks to the bike's climbing ability. So I ended up experimenting quite a bit with this bike at different sag measurements. I started with my default spot just under 30%, and the bike felt very quick and lively, but I did notice a little bit less traction than I would have cared for on those loose and chunky climbs. So I eventually settled at about 31 to 32% sag, and with more sag I found that traction that I was looking for. I did have to be a bit more conscious of where I put my pedals, because I was smacking pedals, and this bike does have a little bit lower bottom bracket, so you will need to be aware of that. At either sag amount that I ran, the bike did a very good job though of smoothing out undulations and bigger bumps on the climbs. So the climbing position on this bike is very comfortable and really balanced. There's plenty of weight going through that front wheel, so it's easy to manage. You can control it very easily. It handles uphill switchbacks very well as really steep inclines. Your weight is right where it needs to be to keep that front wheel under control. The HD6 has some of the best uphill handling characteristics out of any bike in this category. It ends up feeling a little bit more all mountain than it does enduro when it comes to the climbs, and if you ask me, that's a great thing. And to be fair to those other bikes, its geometry is a little bit more on the all mountain side than the full burly enduro side. Overall, I would happily slot the HD6 in near the top of the enduro bikes climbing category. I think it's right there with the Orbea or Rayon. Maybe those two are the best climbing enduro bikes. So it does make it an excellent choice for those really long days in the saddle. Now, jumping into the downhill, the first thing I want to address is how calm the bike rides. Like other Ibises, it feels very, very smooth, except this one feels smooth on steroids. It's also one of the sportiest feeling enduro bikes that I've ever ridden. Put those two things together, one hell of a bike. Starting with the suspension feel on the HD6, it is very calm and composed through the bumps, both big ones and small ones. The small chatter almost completely disappears, and that suspension catches you nice and soft even on some really big compressions. As I said earlier, I tinkered with the suspension quite a bit on this one to find the sweet spot, and I ended up running a bit more sag than I'd normally run. And even at that higher sag, I didn't have any issues with bottoming out harshly or using all of my travel too easily or sitting down into the mid-stroke. So I think the bike actually works a little bit better with a little bit more sag. And all of that points to the HD6 being a great candidate for a coil shock, especially for those folks who want even better small bump compliance. That said, with the air shock, the small bump was great, and I did like the lively, sporty feel of that shock. So the HD6 carries speed and momentum very well. Even with a smaller rear wheel, it doesn't get hung up much at all. In fact, I'd say it's the most full 29 feeling mullet bike that I've ever ridden. It seems to generate speed just about everywhere without too much effort, you know, pumping through rollers and berms, and just as you hold it open, you don't lose your speed on every little bump. And when it comes down to it, that's what it's supposed to do. It's an enduro race bike. It's supposed to be fast. Next up, let's chat about the handling, which is probably the best part about the bike. I rode the HD6 in a wide variety of terrain, from high-speed chunk to slow-speed, tight, twisty tech, and don't tell anyone, I even rode a flow trail. It was impressive in almost every situation. Even with the shorter wheelbase, I was still able to push the pace in rough terrain and high-speed straightaways. Where it really stood out to me, though, was in the corners. It could boil down to the overall wheelbase just being a little bit shorter, or maybe that smaller rear wheel, or Ibis has just landed on a great front to rear length ratio. No matter what, the HD6 corners like a dream. It is ultra responsive without feeling twitchy at all. It's easy to weight the front wheel properly, lean the bike over, and then just let it do its thing. So as I mentioned before, I did struggle a little bit to find that rear wheel traction that I wanted. And before you come at me saying I didn't have my tire pressure or whatever set up right, I did. I don't know how to emphasize that. I ran through a variety of tire pressures. The tire is a great tire. It's a Maxxis Minion DHR2, double down. It should by all means be very grippy. I think it came down to the suspension needing to be run at a little bit higher sag. So once I increased that sag amount, the bike sat down a little bit better and got into its travel just a little bit better, giving me that rear wheel traction that I was looking for. So the HD6 isn't quite as poppy as some other bikes. It's not the most jibby, jumpy bike I've ever ridden, even compared to something like the Santa Cruz Mega Tower. That bike feels a little more jumpy than this one. Overall, it is still a very fun, big bike to ride, and it's because of that combination of the speed it can carry and the way it handles. If you put those two things together, it goes to show you why the Ibis Enduro team has done fairly well on it so far this year. So now let's talk about a couple of comparisons really quick. I want to compare this to the Yeti SB160. In fact, I pulled this thing out of the box and thought, man, that looks like a Yeti. So it is kind of, I don't know. that means nothing, but it'll be fun to compare them anyway. So both of these bikes find themselves on the sportier, faster handling side of the enduro category. And because of that characteristic, they're a little more well-rounded and better suited for us average Joes. They don't penalize you as much when you find yourself on smooth and easy terrain. Even though they're similar, the HD6 does feel a bit sportier and even more responsive than the SB160. And it feels better in the corners and it changes lines easier. The suspension, I think, feels a little bit more active too, especially in that small bump chatter. That said, the Yeti overall is a little bit longer, it's got a longer chainstay, and it is more stable at high speed and in rough terrain. They are both great climbers for the category, but I do think the HD6 probably outclimbs the SB160, maybe by a little bit. So to sum it all up, HD6 is a little more versatile and well-rounded, and the SB160 is a little bit more capable. Now let's compare the HD6 to the Rocky Mountain Altitude. On paper, they're actually super similar, within a half degree and 10 millimeters on most key measurements. The Ibis is a tiny bit slacker and longer, even when you consider the altitude in the slack setting, and it does have a bit more travel too. They both have the same great handling characteristics and a very well-rounded nature. The HD6 feels a little smoother and a little bit more stable, and the Altitude feels a little bit more lively and fun. HD6 is the clear winner on the climbs though. So if you're a jibby, jumpy rider, you might be a little happier on the Altitude. And if you like insane handling mountain bikes, HD6. So who is the HD6 for? This is really hard to not just say everyone, but I'm gonna try to break it down a little bit better than that. So the HD6 is a big bike, there is no doubt about that. It's squishy, heavy-ish, and burly. But if you rode it without knowing any of the numbers, you'd be surprised to learn that it's as enduro as it is. And I think I just used enduro as an adjective, but whatever. The way it handles in corners is pretty special. All of this is to say it's a great option for someone who likes a big, confident bike without many of the drawbacks of a big, confident bike. If you're willing to put up with climbing a little bit slower than you would on like a trail or all mountain bike in favor of some confidence and capability, you're gonna dig the HD6. If you want to try your hand at enduro racing, but you don't wanna be pigeonholed into like full-blown gnarly enduro bike, I think you should try the HD6 because it'll let you race. It's a very fast racer, a very fast bike, but it's a little more versatile and well-rounded due to its handling characteristics and cornering capability. And from what I understand, that is where races are won or lost. They're not won on the straightaways, they're won in the corners. I am definitely not a racer. I am way too slow to race, but this bike is very appealing to me because I like to ride difficult trails with as much pace as I can. Most of the time too, I end up pedaling my out of shape butt to the top of those trails as well. So maybe the HD6 is actually a really good bike for the anti-racer like myself for the exact same reasons that an elite level racer would find this bike attractive. So that's going to do it for the HD6. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.